October 24, 1962. Fort George G. Meade, Maryland. Inside the National Security Agency's Operations Center, dozens of cryptanalysts work in shifts around IBM mainframe computers, processing intercepted Soviet communications. The Cuban Missile Crisis has entered its 7th day. President Kennedy and his advisors need intelligence about Soviet intentions, Soviet military dispositions in Cuba, and Soviet naval movements in the Caribbean. The fate of the world may depend on whether American intelligence can determine what Soviet leadership intends before those intentions become actions. At 0347 hours, senior cryptanalyst Robert Morrison completes decryption of a Soviet Navy communication transmitted 18 hours earlier from the Northern Fleet headquarters in Severomorsk. The message directs 4 Foxtrot-class submarines operating in the Caribbean to maintain patrol stations between Cuba and Florida, specifying precise coordinates. Morrison cross-references the coordinates with current US Navy tracking data. The submarines are exactly where the decrypted message indicates they should be. The decrypt is genuine. The intelligence is actionable. At 1100 hours, another decrypt arrives on Morrison's desk, this one from Soviet military communications in Cuba. The message reports completion of nuclear warhead installations at specific missile sites, provides technical details about readiness status, and requests additional support equipment. NSA analysts compile the decrypt with previous intelligence, creating a comprehensive picture of Soviet nuclear capabilities on the island. By 1500 hours, the compiled intelligence report reaches the White House. President Kennedy receives detailed information about Soviet military operations in Cuba within 6 hours of the original Soviet transmission. Some Soviet field commanders haven't received their orders yet, when American leadership already knows what those orders contain. Soviet leadership in Moscow believes their communications remain secure. They employ sophisticated encryption systems, maintain strict operational security protocols, and train their officers that American cryptanalytic capability lags decades behind Soviet achievements. They are catastrophically wrong. The National Security Agency has achieved cryptographic superiority so complete that American intelligence routinely reads Soviet military and intelligence communications faster than Soviet bureaucracy can distribute them to intended recipients. This asymmetric intelligence advantage provides the United States with strategic benefits throughout the Cold War that Soviet leadership never suspects and discovers only decades later when archives open after the Soviet Union's collapse. Soviet confidence in their cryptographic security reflected both genuine capability and systematic underestimation of American technology. Soviet cryptographic systems in the 1960s through 1980s incorporated sophisticated techniques developed over decades of signals intelligence experience. The foundation of Soviet military and intelligence communication security rested on one-time pad encryption, a system that remains theoretically unbreakable when employed correctly. One-time pads use random key sequences that encrypt messages with perfect security if the keys are truly random, used only once, and kept completely secure. Soviet cryptographers correctly understood that properly implemented one-time pad systems cannot be defeated through mathematical cryptanalysis. Soviet agencies supplemented one-time pad systems with mechanical cipher machines for routine communications, where one-time pad security proved impractical. The Fialka M125 cipher machine, introduced in the 1950s and used extensively through the 1980s, employed rotating cipher wheels that scrambled plaintext messages through multiple encryption stages. The Fialka generated encrypted text that appeared to be random character sequences resistant to frequency analysis and other classical cryptanalytic techniques. Soviet engineers continuously refined the Fialka design, confident that its complexity exceeded American capability to defeat it systematically. Soviet high-frequency radio networks transmitted these encrypted communications across vast distances, connecting Moscow with Soviet forces worldwide. The radio networks employed frequency hopping, burst transmission techniques, and other methods designed to complicate American interception efforts. Soviet communications officers trained extensively in proper encryption procedures, understanding that security depended on correct implementation of cryptographic systems. Soviet military doctrine emphasized communication security as fundamental to operational success. KGB and GRU training programs taught intelligence officers that American cryptanalysis capabilities remained decades behind Soviet achievements. This assessment reflected Soviet experience during World War II, when Soviet cryptographers achieved some success against German communications, while understanding that American cryptanalytic efforts focused primarily on German and Japanese systems rather than Soviet ones. Soviet intelligence training emphasized that the United States prioritized human intelligence collection over signals intelligence, investing fewer resources in cryptanalysis. Soviet military leadership believed that Soviet mathematical expertise in cryptography exceeded American capabilities because Soviet academic institutions emphasized mathematics, and Soviet cryptographers operated without the bureaucratic constraints that Soviet analysts assumed hampered American intelligence agencies. These Soviet assessments proved wrong on virtually every point. American signals intelligence investment dwarfed Soviet spending. American cryptanalytic capability exceeded Soviet systems substantially. The computing revolution that transformed American industry provided cryptanalytic tools Soviet organizations couldn't match. Soviet confidence in their communication security reflected systematic underestimation of American technological advantages and organizational capabilities that became decisive throughout the Cold War. The National Security Agency traces its origins to November 4, 1952, when President Truman issued a classified directive establishing the agency and absorbing the Armed Forces Security Agency, Signals Intelligence functions. The NSA operated under secrecy so complete that its existence remained unacknowledged publicly for years. Agency employees joked that NSA stood for no such agency, a designation that accurately reflected the organization's extreme compartmentalization and security consciousness. Behind this secrecy, the NSA built the most sophisticated signals intelligence organization in history. Personnel numbers grew rapidly as Cold War tensions intensified. By the 1960s, the NSA employed more than 10,000 cryptanalysts, mathematicians, linguists, computer specialists, and support personnel. Fort Meade, Maryland became NSA headquarters, hosting massive computer facilities and operations centers that process signals intelligence around the clock. The workforce included the nation's most talented mathematicians, many recruited directly from top universities with offers of challenging work on problems no academic institution could match. The concentration of mathematical talent at Fort Meade exceeded that of any university in the world. NSA's budget remained classified, but estimates suggest annual expenditures exceeding $10 billion by the 1980s. This investment funded computing infrastructure, satellite systems, global ground stations, research programs, and personnel that collectively created intelligence-gathering capability on a scale no other nation approached. The budget reflected American recognition that signals intelligence provided strategic advantages worth enormous investment. Every dollar spent on cryptanalytic capability potentially revealed Soviet intentions, prevented surprise attacks, and provided American leadership with information that informed policy decisions. The technology evolution within NSA paralleled broader American computing advancement. In the 1960s, IBM mainframe computers processed millions of intercepted communications, applying automated analysis that human cryptanalysts alone couldn't achieve at necessary scale. These systems performed frequency analysis, identified communication patterns, and flagged messages likely containing high-value intelligence. By the 1970s, Cray research supercomputers enabled NSA to tackle increasingly complex cipher systems, applying computational power against encryption algorithms that would resist manual cryptanalysis. The Cray-1 supercomputer, capable of 160 million floating-point operations per second, could test encryption key combinations at rates impossible for human analysts. Multiple Cray systems operating in parallel enabled NSA to maintain persistent cryptanalytic campaigns against Soviet systems. The 1980s brought parallel processing architectures that distributed cryptanalysis across hundreds or thousands of processors working simultaneously. These systems enabled real-time decryption of intercepted Soviet communications, processing messages faster than Soviet bureaucracy could distribute them to intended recipients. American commanders received intelligence about Soviet military activities before Soviet field commanders understood what their orders contained. This temporal advantage proved as valuable as the intelligence content itself. SIGINT satellite systems provided global interception capability that gave NSA access to Soviet communications regardless of where they originated. Canyon satellites, first launched in 1968, orbited in geosynchronous positions above the Soviet Union, intercepting microwave communications, telephone conversations, and military radio traffic. Rhyolite satellites, deployed starting in 1970, provided even more sophisticated interception capability with improved receivers and broader frequency coverage. Chalet satellites, later redesignated Vortex, achieved operational status in 1978, with enhanced capability to intercept Soviet satellite communications and telemetry data from ballistic missile tests. These satellite systems transformed signals intelligence by eliminating geographic limitations on collection. Ground-based intercept stations required positioning near Soviet territory, limiting coverage and creating vulnerabilities to Soviet countermeasures. Satellites positioned in geosynchronous orbit, 36,000 kilometers above Earth, could intercept communications across the entire Soviet Union simultaneously. The combination of multiple satellites in carefully selected orbits provided redundant coverage that ensured no significant Soviet transmission went unmonitored. Ground stations complemented satellite collection by providing dedicated intercept capability against specific targets. RAF Menwith Hill in England operated massive antenna arrays focused on Soviet communications transiting European airspace. Bad Aibling Station in West Germany intercepted Soviet military communications from Warsaw Pact exercises and routine operations. Misawa Air Base in Japan monitored Soviet Far East military activities and communications with Soviet forces in the Pacific region. These stations employed sophisticated direction-finding equipment that triangulated Soviet transmitter locations, providing not only message content but also precise geographic information about Soviet force dispositions. Project Venona represented NSA's longest-running and most successful cryptanalytic campaign. Beginning in 1943 and continuing through 1980, Venona focused on Soviet intelligence communications between Moscow and Soviet intelligence officers operating in the United States and other Western nations. Soviet intelligence agencies employed one-time pad encryption for these communications, which should have provided perfect security, but Soviet operational practices compromised that security through a critical error. During World War II, the volume of intelligence traffic exceeded the supply of one-time pad key material. Soviet cryptographers responded by reusing portions of key sequences, violating the fundamental requirement that one-time pads must actually be used only once. NSA cryptanalysts, working with enormous patience and sophisticated statistical analysis, identified the reused key sequences and gradually reconstructed portions of the encryption keys. This breakthrough enabled decryption of thousands of Soviet intelligence messages, revealing extensive Soviet espionage networks operating in the United States during and after World War II. Venona decrypts identified Soviet intelligence officers, revealed their methods, compromised their sources, and provided evidence that informed American counterintelligence operations for decades. The project remained so highly classified that Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson received intelligence derived from Venona without being told about the program's existence or methods. Only after the Cold War ended did NSA declassify Venona materials, revealing the project's scope and success. Bull-run programs targeted Soviet encryption standards and implementations, seeking vulnerabilities that would enable systematic decryption of protected communications. NSA mathematicians analyzed Soviet cipher algorithms, looking for mathematical weaknesses that could be exploited. They examined Soviet cryptographic equipment, sometimes acquiring examples through intelligence operations or allies, studying implementations for flaws that theory missed. They developed specialized computing systems optimized for specific cryptanalytic tasks, creating custom hardware that performed certain calculations thousands of times faster than general-purpose computers. Partnerships with British government communications headquarters and the other Five Eyes intelligence agencies multiplied NSA's effective capabilities. GCHQ provided access to intercept stations throughout the former British Empire, creating global coverage that neither nation could achieve independently. Canadian Communications Security Establishment monitored Soviet activities in the Arctic. Australian Defence Signals Directorate covered the Pacific region. New Zealand Government Communications Security Bureau provided coverage of the South Pacific. These partnerships shared raw intercepts, cryptanalytic breakthroughs, and finished intelligence, creating an integrated signals intelligence network that Soviet countermeasures couldn't defeat. Cryptanalytic methods evolved continuously as Soviet systems became more sophisticated. Traffic analysis examined communication patterns without decrypting message content. By monitoring who communicated with whom, when communications occurred, how frequently specific senders and receivers exchanged messages, NSA analysts inferred organizational relationships, command hierarchies, and operational patterns. A sudden increase in communications between Moscow and a particular military district might indicate preparations for exercises or operations even if the messages themselves remained encrypted. Changes in communication volume, routing, or schedules provided intelligence independently of message content. Known plaintext attacks exploited instances where NSA possessed both encrypted and unencrypted versions of the same message. Soviet operational security failures occasionally resulted in messages being transmitted both encrypted and unencrypted, or in encrypted messages being followed by summaries transmitted without encryption. These instances provided cryptanalysts with matched plaintext ciphertext pairs that revealed encryption keys or algorithm details. A single known plaintext example might enable decryption of hundreds or thousands of messages encrypted with the same system or key sequence. Soviet operational security failures provided NSA with opportunities that proper security practices would have prevented. The reused one-time pads that compromised Venona represented the most famous example, but many others occurred throughout the Cold War. Soviet communications officers sometimes failed to destroy compromised key material properly. Soviet operators transmitted sensitive information unencrypted when encryption equipment malfunctioned, preferring to accept security risks rather than delay time-critical messages. Soviet bureaucracy created predictable communication schedules that enabled NSA to focus collection resources at times when high-value traffic was most likely. These human factors proved as important as mathematical cryptanalysis in enabling NSA success. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 demonstrated NSA capabilities with strategic consequences. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev and his military commanders communicated extensively with Soviet forces in Cuba and Soviet naval units in the Caribbean. These communications traveled via radio links that American intercept stations and satellites monitored comprehensively. NSA cryptanalysts worked around the clock processing intercepted traffic, prioritizing messages likely to contain critical intelligence. Soviet Navy communications revealed submarine positions with precision that enabled US Navy anti-submarine forces to track every Soviet submarine in the Caribbean. American destroyers and patrol aircraft maintained contact with Soviet submarines, ensuring that Soviet commanders understood that their submarines operated under continuous American surveillance. This knowledge constrained Soviet options, as any attempt to employ submarines aggressively would occur under conditions where American forces had tactical advantage. Decrypts of Soviet military communications from Cuba provided detailed intelligence about nuclear warhead locations, missile site construction progress, and Soviet command structures. American intelligence knew which missile sites had received warheads, which remained under construction, which had achieved operational capability. This intelligence informed American military planning and diplomatic strategy. President Kennedy could negotiate with Premier Khrushchev while knowing precisely what Soviet capabilities in Cuba actually were, rather than relying on estimates that might prove wrong. The intelligence advantage proved decisive during critical moments of the crisis. When Soviet ships approached the American naval quarantine line, NSA decrypts revealed whether ships carried military cargo that would trigger confrontation. When Soviet forces in Cuba appeared to prepare for possible combat, decrypts clarified whether preparations reflected local commander initiatives or orders from Moscow. The intelligence reduced uncertainty at moments when miscalculation could trigger nuclear war. Vietnam War operations benefited substantially from NSA's ability to intercept and decrypt North Vietnamese army communications. North Vietnamese forces employed relatively simple encryption systems, often Soviet-supplied cipher machines, that NSA had analyzed extensively. Intercepted communications provided tactical intelligence about North Vietnamese unit movements, logistics preparations, and operational plans. American commanders received warnings about North Vietnamese offensive operations days or sometimes weeks before those operations commenced, enabling defensive preparations that reduced American casualties and improved combat effectiveness. Soviet military exercises provided NSA with intelligence about Soviet doctrine, capabilities, and readiness. Large-scale Warsaw Pact exercises involved massive communications traffic as Soviet commanders coordinated hundreds of thousands of troops across multiple nations. NSA intercepted and decrypted communications that revealed how Soviet forces actually operated, what procedures they followed, what capabilities they demonstrated, how effectively units coordinated. This intelligence informed American military planning, revealing Soviet strengths to respect and weaknesses to exploit. American commanders understood Soviet doctrine better than many Soviet officers because American intelligence had access to communications from all levels of Soviet command hierarchies. KGB operations suffered comprehensive compromise through NSA's ability to intercept agent communications. Soviet intelligence officers attempting to communicate with agents in Western nations employed encrypted radio systems that NSA targeted aggressively. Intercepted communications revealed agent identities, communication schedules, operational plans, intelligence requirements. American counterintelligence could identify Soviet agents even when those agents successfully concealed their activities from routine surveillance. The compromise of KGB communications created persistent security problems for Soviet intelligence throughout the Cold War. Submarine tracking combined signals intelligence with acoustic surveillance to maintain comprehensive awareness of Soviet submarine operations. Soviet submarines transmitted radio communications to receive orders, report positions, and coordinate with other units. These transmissions, even when encrypted, provided NSA with information about submarine locations that complemented acoustic data from the SOSUS underwater surveillance network. The combination enabled US Navy anti-submarine forces to track Soviet submarines with precision that Soviet commanders considered impossible. Soviet submarine commanders assumed they operated undetected when American forces actually maintained continuous contact. Soviet weapons testing communications provided intelligence about new systems before they entered operational service. Soviet ballistic missile tests involved extensive telemetry transmissions that reported missile performance throughout flight. NSA satellites and ground stations intercepted this telemetry, providing American intelligence with detailed understanding of Soviet missile capabilities. Communications during weapons tests revealed technical specifications, performance parameters, reliability issues. American weapons designers knew Soviet capabilities sometimes before Soviet production decisions were finalized. The Polish Solidarity Crisis in 1981 demonstrated NSA's strategic intelligence value. When the Solidarity labor movement challenged Communist Party control in Poland, Soviet leadership considered military intervention to prevent the communist government's collapse. Soviet military communications revealed preparations for potential invasion, including unit mobilizations, logistics preparations, and coordination with Polish military forces. NSA provided American policymakers with advance warning that enabled the United States to communicate clearly to Soviet leadership that military intervention would trigger serious consequences. The intelligence contribution to Western diplomatic pressure that ultimately constrained Soviet actions illustrated signals intelligence is strategic value beyond purely military applications. Soviet operations in Afghanistan from 1979 through 1989 occurred under comprehensive American signals intelligence surveillance. Soviet Army and Air Force communications within Afghanistan traveled via radio networks that American satellites intercepted continuously. NSA provided CIA with intelligence that CIA shared with Afghan Mujahideen resistance forces, enabling attacks against Soviet logistics, ambushes of Soviet patrols, and evasion of Soviet sweep operations. Soviet commanders complained throughout the war that their operations seemed compromised, that Afghan forces anticipated Soviet movements, that surprise proved impossible to achieve. They never understood that American signals intelligence provided Afghan resistance with intelligence advantages that guerrilla forces rarely possess. The personal dimension of intercepted Soviet military communications provided human intelligence that complemented technical military information. Soviet officers discussed families, logistics problems, morale issues, personal concerns. These conversations, transmitted via radio systems the officers believed secure, revealed information about Soviet military life that informed American understanding of Soviet forces beyond simple technical capabilities. American intelligence analysts learned about ammunition shortages, equipment maintenance problems, training deficiencies, leadership issues. This human intelligence dimension proved valuable in assessing Soviet military effectiveness and identifying vulnerabilities that technical intelligence alone might miss. Soviet operational security failures persisted throughout the Cold War, despite awareness that American intelligence posed threats. Soviet communications officers sometimes reused one-time pad keys due to supply constraints, compromising the theoretically unbreakable encryption system through procedural failures. Soviet operators transmitted sensitive information unencrypted when cipher equipment malfunctioned, accepting security risks to maintain communications. Soviet bureaucracy created predictable communication schedules that enabled American intelligence to focus collection resources efficiently. These failures reflected systemic problems within Soviet military and intelligence organizations that training and procedures couldn't fully correct. The reasons Soviet signals intelligence couldn't match NSA capabilities reflected fundamental advantages American organizations possessed. Computing power represented the most obvious disparity. American commercial and military computing markets generated continuous technological advancement that Soviet military-only approach couldn't match. American companies competed to develop faster processors, more memory, better software, because commercial markets rewarded innovation. Soviet computing development occurred entirely within military and intelligence organizations, insulated from competitive pressure, focused on narrow military applications. The result was predictable. American computing technology advanced rapidly while Soviet systems struggled to match capabilities American systems had demonstrated years earlier. Mathematical talent concentration at NSA exceeded anything Soviet intelligence organizations achieved. American universities attracted mathematicians globally, creating intellectual environments where cryptanalytic research flourished. NSA recruited from this talent pool, offering challenging problems and resources that academic institutions couldn't match. Soviet mathematicians, while talented, worked within compartmentalized organizations where collaboration across disciplines proved difficult and exposure to international mathematical research remained limited. American open research environment, where mathematicians published findings and shared techniques, accelerated cryptanalytic advancement. Soviet secrecy, while protecting sources and methods, slowed overall progress by preventing collaboration that could have generated breakthroughs. Budget disparities created operational capacity gaps that Soviet organizations couldn't bridge. NSA's estimated $10 billion annual budget in the 1980s exceeded total Soviet signals intelligence spending by approximately 10-1. This funding enabled NSA to pursue multiple cryptanalytic approaches simultaneously, to develop specialized computing systems for specific problems, to maintain global collection infrastructure, to employ personnel in numbers Soviet organizations couldn't match. Soviet signals intelligence operated under resource constraints that forced prioritization. limiting capability against targets NSA could address with massive resources. Satellite capability reflected American space program advantages that Soviet space efforts never fully matched for intelligence applications. American SIGINT satellites provided superior coverage, better receivers, more sophisticated processing, longer operational lifetimes. Soviet satellites operated with shorter service lives, required more frequent replacements, provided less comprehensive coverage. American satellite technology benefited from commercial space industry development that Soviet military space programs couldn't replicate. The resulting disparity meant American signals intelligence enjoyed collection capabilities Soviet organizations couldn't achieve. Linguistic capability created significant advantages for NSA operations against Soviet targets. NSA recruited native Russian speakers from émigré communities, trained analysts extensively in Russian language and Soviet military terminology, and maintained linguistic expertise across dozens of languages used within the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact nations. Soviet intelligence agencies attempting to process American communications struggled with English language nuances and American cultural references. While Soviet agencies possessed capable linguists, the scale of NSA's linguistic resources exceeded Soviet capabilities substantially, enabling comprehensive processing of intercepted Soviet communications that Soviet agencies couldn't reciprocate against American traffic. Operational tempo differences reflected organizational capacity disparities. NSA processed millions of communications daily by the 1980s, applying automated analysis that flagged high-value messages for human examination while routing routine traffic to databases for pattern analysis. Soviet signals intelligence systems, overwhelmed by volume, struggled to process collected intercepts effectively. Soviet analysts worked with less sophisticated tools, processed fewer messages, faced backlogs that degraded intelligence timeliness. American intelligence received processed intelligence within hours, while Soviet analysts dealt with backlogs measured in days or weeks. The strategic impact of NSA's signals intelligence superiority provided American leadership with asymmetric advantages throughout the Cold War. American presidents, defense secretaries, military commanders, and diplomats operated with intelligence about Soviet intentions, capabilities, and activities that Soviet leadership didn't possess about American operations. This intelligence asymmetry enabled better decision-making, reduced uncertainty, prevented miscalculations. American military planning could account for actual Soviet capabilities rather than worst-case estimates. American diplomacy could operate with knowledge of Soviet positions before negotiations began. American defense programs could focus on countering real Soviet systems rather than theoretical threats. Soviet leadership discovered the extent of NSA's success only after the Cold War ended and archives opened. Russian intelligence officers gaining access to American intelligence records from the 1960s through 1980s expressed shock at how comprehensively Soviet communications had been compromised. Soviet generals learning that American intelligence had routinely read their communications for decades found the revelation disturbing. The discovery that systems Soviet cryptographers had considered secure had been systematically defeated undermined confidence in Soviet Cold War security practices. Modern implications of Cold War signals. Intelligence competition continue shaping intelligence operations and cybersecurity practices. NSA capabilities increased exponentially with the transition from analog to digital communications. Fiber optic cables, cell phone networks, internet traffic, email, instant messaging, all create electronic communications more vulnerable to interception and analysis than traditional radio systems. NSA's budget and personnel expanded from Cold War levels to address these opportunities. Russian intelligence reformed signals intelligence programs in the 1990s and 2000s, attempting to close gaps that Cold War competition had revealed. The current encryption debates between government agencies seeking access to communications and privacy advocates defending encryption reflect Cold War cryptographic competition as legacy. The story of NSA's signals intelligence success during the Cold War illustrates how sustained investment in technical intelligence mathematical expertise, and computing capability create strategic advantages that conventional military forces cannot replicate. Soviet cryptographic systems employed sound principles that should have provided security. Soviet communications officers trained in proper procedures that should have prevented compromise, but NSA's combination of superior computing power, mathematical talent, global collection infrastructure, and massive resource investment defeated Soviet systems comprehensively. Soviet leaders transmitted orders believing their communications remained secure, while American intelligence read those orders before Soviet commanders received them. This intelligence asymmetry shaped Cold War outcomes in ways Soviet leadership never understood until decades after the competition ended. Soviets believed their codes remained unbreakable. NSA broke them before Moscow even finished distributing the messages.